The C-SPAN networks bring you long-form public affairs programming from the nation's capital and are a public service of your television provider. C-SPAN, created by cable.
Q&A. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author David Finkel discusses his latest book, titled Thank You for Your Service.
David Finkel, at what point did you decide to call this book Thank You for Your Service?
Well, this came late in the game, after I'd turned in the manuscript and we were searching around for a title. I had another one in mind, which was The Suicide Room. And when I mentioned that to the publisher, she said, that is just a terrific title. And then she said, are you trying to put us out of business? And I said, I'd read that book. And she said, that's really not the right title for this book. And we sat and batted it around, and there's something about this phrase. I was worried because it would come across as judgmental in some way, or people would see it as almost bitterly ironic. And that wasn't the intention. It's a much simpler meaning, which comes down to, and this is what I got comfortable with finally. If you read the book and if you get to know these people inside the book and hear their stories, you'll have a better sense. If you say this ubiquitous phrase, thank you for your service, you'll have a much clearer idea of who you're thanking and what you're thanking them for. So that seemed to be a good title at that point.
How many of the people you're writing about in this book were in the first book about Iraq, The Good Soldiers?
Well, one was named, and the others were kind of circling around the edges and not named. But these are all people I had gotten to know during the reporting of the first book, which was in Baghdad during the surge. This was an Army infantry battalion, if I can fill it in really quickly. These guys went into the part of the war called the surge. They were there for 15 months in a lousy neighborhood in East Baghdad, and I was with them to write the first book. Not about me, but to live with them, to write about them, and got to know them all. Was with them when bad things happened, and stayed in touch, and they became the people of the new book.
Where was their base?
Fort Riley, Kansas. So I mean, think of the moment. This is, I know it seems like history at this point. Well, I guess it is history. But the war had been through several versions at that point, and you know, the common perception was the thing was all but lost, and it was edging up to what I've described as the tragic moment of the war. And into that moment went this Army infantry battalion, 800 guys. Most deploying for the first time, most young and full of a young man's invincibility, and off they went, and then they had a tough time.
What was the average age? 19,
20, most, like I said, most hadn't been out of the country before, much less deployed into a war before. And I mean, they were remarkable, because if they weren't filled with the perfect version of what we might describe as patriotism, they certainly had a sense of large mission in mind. They were going to win the thing. And you know, what happened is what happens in war. The war is bigger than anything, and by the time they came home, and they had lost guys, and they had had physical injuries, and their psychological wounds were beginning to cement in to what they've turned into now, of course they were changed, and now they get to deal with it for a long, long time.
How did you select the battalion that you, or was it a company or a battalion?
It was a battalion. Oh, you know, now I know the difference. When I started this thing, I'm not from a military family, so I didn't really know a brigade from a battalion from a company. They were on the chart. These were the guys going into it. And the Washington Post, where I've been a reporter and editor for 23 years, had me go report a story on this next group going into this new thing. And while I was reporting the Post story, the battalion commander just said, you know, you might want to visit us at some point during our deployment and see how we're doing, and maybe, who knows, do another story at the end to see what's happened to us. And out of that came an idea that actually what I should do is take a leave from the Post, go live with these guys and write a book about, not about the Iraq War, because there have been so many books about the war at that point, not a policy book, but use the war really to write a more intimate story about in such a moment, what happens to a young man. So that's what I did.
You have a photo that's used on the cover of this book. I've seen it before.
Yeah.
Where'd it come from?
Yeah, it's Damon Winter's photo for the New York Times. And after we had selected the title and we were looking around for an image to go with this, my wife recalled this image, and as soon as she showed it to me on a computer, it just knocked me out. I sent it up to the publisher, Sarah Crichton Books, and she was crazy about it. And I mean, I just look at this photograph all the time, and sometimes I look at it in terms of how much the same these guys look. Then you can look closer and see how different they look. Sometimes I look at it and think of where I was sitting on that kind of plane when I was leaving the war after my time on the ground with them. Sometimes I look at that photograph and it just seems to be like, forgive me for the image, but rows of tablets at Arlington.
How long do they have to sit in that position, and do they have their backpacks on?
Yeah, you know, most of their gear is bundled up at the back on these pallets, their big sacks and everything. But you know, you're full kit. You're wearing all your body armor, all of your eye probe, everything you're supposed to wear in war. You're wearing on that plane as you exit it for the final time.
What do you see?
Well, I see. I see 6 years of what this story has felt like. I mean, I've been pursuing this thing since 2007, and I've gotten to know these guys, and I've gotten to know those planes and those positions, and again, the transition from invincibility to a flat-out weariness and recognition of, so this is how it turned out.
What's the difference between The Good Soldiers, which was published in 2009, and this new book, Thank You for Your Service?
The new book is volume 2. What happened is these guys came home. The book, Good Soldiers, came out. I thought that was it. I had done my job as a journalist. I was proud of the book. I thought I got it right. I had paid attention to their corner, not the big policy stuff, but their corner of the war, and I had told their story well, and I thought I was done. But they began getting in touch with me by email, by phone call, and say that, you know, things aren't going so hot. They're not feeling quite right, not sleeping well. Some guys talked of anxiousness, depression. There were a couple of suicide attempts. And I had read widely enough about the effects of war, and some of this is common sense, that I thought I had done half the story, and let's get busy and do the second half, which is the new book. First one is Guys at War. The second one is they come home, and now it's their families and them trying to adjust to what life has become after the war.
You have to read it. Those watching have to read it to know why I'm asking this question, but you quote specifically throughout this entire book what people are saying, soldiers, their wives, and all that stuff. Were you present for all these quotes?
Yes, well, almost all. I mean, the style of journalism I do is I guess we call it immersion journalism, and it doesn't depend so much on an interview after the fact to find out what happened. It depends on being present, and being present enough so the interview fades just into the type of reporting when you're just there. You don't have to ask questions. You don't want to ask questions. You just want to see what's happening in front of you.
Did they all have to say in advance or sign anything they said you could use?
I'm at this point in the evolution of journalism. We used to get the benefit of the doubt when I started this kind of thing, but not so much anymore. So I sit down with people. I explain what I want to do, what my style of reporting is. I might give them a couple of samples of previous work so they can make some kind of informed decision about whether they want to be involved. And if they say yes, off we go.
Video from the Washington Post website that you voiced over, was this back in 2007 or 8?
Yeah, it would have been when these guys, the 216 Infantry Battalion, this was one of the convoys. This is what they did. This is what their war was. By days, they were in convoys going around this rather vicious neighborhood, trying to get to know the populace. That was the main idea of this counterinsurgency strategy. But basically, what they were doing is driving around waiting to get blown up. And at night, they'd go search for bad guys who were blowing them up.
What does 2-16 mean?
You know, it's this long thing. Basically, it's the designation for this infantry battalion. You know, they all have numbers and they all have identifiers. And this is just what this one is called. It's all part of the 1st Infantry Division. And then you just go down the hill from there with more and more numbers until you can identify the unit.
Here's the video that you have on the
Okay.
website.
They carried tourniquets, bandages, 240 rounds of ammunition, and grenades. All of them carried an assault rifle. Some of them carried good luck charms. Some would sit with one foot in front of the other, so if a roadside bomb went off, they might lose 1 foot instead of 2. Sometimes they joked about what their last words would be. But always, every day, they would get in their Humvees and off they would go. This day, the trip was from one base in eastern Baghdad to another, along a road called Route Pluto. They drove at 10 miles per hour, maybe 15, to increase chances of finding a bomb before it went off. Finally, almost there, the first Humvee turned right off the main road. You can see it in the distance right now. There it goes. And then...
This may be a naive question, but why did we do that, knowing that these Humvees would be blown up?
Well, they were trying to get from here to there to carry out their corner of the war, right? And along the way, in this part of Baghdad, forgive me, I haven't seen that video in a little while. It's in that part of Baghdad, this Shiite area, a little south of Sadr City. The weapon of choice at that point was a type of improvised explosive device called an EFP, explosively formed penetrator. Can I take a second and describe it?
Sure.
So it's basically, I mean, to be simple about it, it's known as a shape charge. It's a tube filled with explosives, and attached to one end typically was some kind of milled copper disc, perhaps the size of a dinner plate. And coming out the other end was a wire going to some guy in the shadow who was waiting to hit the trigger when a convoy of soldiers reached a certain aiming point. In other words, if there was a broken light pole in the distance, and once a convoy hit that, boom, there it goes. And what happens with these things is the copper plate is propelled forward at such a high velocity it becomes semi-molten. Almost, if you could see it, I guess it's been described as tadpole shaped, and it just burns right through whatever it hits. And if it's aimed well, and it often was aimed well, it would burn through a very thick armored door of the very best, most expensive Humvee we were giving soldiers at that point. It would burn inside and just cause complete chaos.
Did you shoot that video?
I didn't. No, that was a helmet video. The soldiers recorded a lot of things. So there's a lot of information about this war. A lot of documentation that comes from individual diaries, from a lot of photographs, from helmet cams, the whole deal. It's just out there and available.
Would you ride is that a Humvee or was it a MRAP?
No, the MRAPs came later. These guys were waiting for them because those things kind of had V-shaped hulls that might deflect these things a little better, and did. But they were awfully slow in coming, and they didn't reach these guys until the very end of their deployment. So they were going around in Humvees. These were, what, 12,000-pound things? They cost a lot of money.
Would you ride one of those, like just in a convoy just like that?
Well, sure. I mean, if I'm going to be honest about it, at first, and I was with them on the ground for about 8 months, maybe a month, 6 weeks at a time. And at first I was going out all the time. But by the end, forgive me, but I had become rattled enough by the experience, by the explosions, by everything else that was going on, that I only went out when I knew there was a good chance of seeing something new. And that's not the perfect way to do journalism. You want to just always go out, be available for the serendipity of what a day might bring. But after going out enough days, and I got a little reluctant toward the end.
Let me jump to the middle of your book, and one of the soldiers that you write about, fairly prominently, we'll show a photo on the screen, Adam Schumann.
Yes.
Why did you focus on him, and where is he today? Okay,
so Adam Schumann, you're going to think I'm not capable of a short answer, but I do need to explain Adam Schumann. I met Adam one day while I was doing the reporting for the first book. There was a relatively quiet time, and I was asking around, who do you all regard as a great soldier? Who do I need to meet? And somebody had mentioned this guy Schumann. I hadn't heard of him. I hadn't met him. A few days passed, and I went in search of him and walked into a room. And this photograph is later, but I have another photograph in the book of what I saw when I walked into his room. And it was this great soldier was this gaunt, haunted-looking man. And I introduced myself, and he said, "I guess I know why you're here." And I said, "Well, I want to write about you. I hear you're a great soldier." And he kind of laughed, and he said he was leaving the war that day. He was done. And what had happened is there was this guy was on his third deployment. He was a little older, so guys looked up to him. He was a leader, great soldier, 3 deployments. By his count, he had been in combat about 1,000 days. I'm in the middle of reading this Rick Atkinson book now about World War II, and I just went through a passage where even in that great war, where there was almost a sense of morality to it, guiding the mission. In that case, if guys had been in combat for 200 days, they tried to take them off the front lines for a little while. So here's a guy, 1,000 days, a lot of bad things had happened. And he cracked open. He couldn't do it. And
where did you see him when you first talked to him?
In his room, waiting to go to the helicopter to leave the war. So I stayed with him, and we talked for a while. And then he walked to the helicopter, and the guy was not thinking of how well he had done performing someone else's policy, and he had done well.
What was his rank?
The guy was just cloaked in shame as he walked to the helicopter.
I'm saying, what was his rank? His military rank?
I'm sorry, sergeant. He was a staff sergeant, and there he went, out of the war on a helicopter with a big red cross on the side, and he was embarrassed about it, and he came home, as I said, with a sense of shame and guilt that he had to leave the war, and that continues to define much of his life since. Just trying to overcome this. It's not logical, Brian. He had done well, but in the own conversation he was having in his head about himself, for whatever reason, he was ashamed and came home and is busy trying to recover.
When did you go back to him for this book?
Well, after the first book came out, I kept in touch with him. He said something one day. I'm gonna get the quote a little bit wrong, but it was something like, I was a normal guy, and I got sent to Iraq where I became crazy. So they sent me back to America to become normal, and now it's America that's driving me crazy. And I didn't know what that meant, but I liked the sound of it, and I was curious about it. And then as I got more calls from more people who were having a difficult time, he became the centerpiece of the new book.
If I jump in, I'll just read some of it back to you, and you can
please
fill in the blanks.
Okay.
Page 86. You say, these are your words, over time, the war came to mean less and less until it meant nothing at all. And meanwhile, the other soldiers meant more and more until they came to mean, came to mean everything.
Right.
What's the point?
Okay, the point is, and anyone who has been in war will tell you the same thing. Over time, war doesn't become about policy or mission or really winning or losing. It's about the guy next to you. Just taking care of the guy next to you. And I have to tell you, the tenderness between soldiers is if you ever need a definition of tenderness, there it is. These guys taking care of each other.
Who's Golem? Is it Golombek? Is that what you
Golombek.
Golombek?
Yeah. Yep.
Who is he?
So he was one of Schumann's soldiers, and after a day in which another soldier was hit by one of these bombs I described and died, Schumann was supposed to be along on that mission, but for various reasons he was kept back at the base, so he didn't go. Schumann's the guy, as I described, the best eyes, always found the bombs. He wasn't there that day. A bomb went off, and a guy named James Doster died from the explosion. And afterwards, this guy Golombek said to Schumann, and let me paraphrase to keep out the profanity, "This wouldn't have happened if you were there." And he meant it as a compliment. But Schumann already in this degrading transition, this internal degrading transition, heard it as one more reason he should feel guilty, that it was blame, that it was an indictment, the guy would be alive if you had been there. So it wasn't a compliment, it was just one more thing on his path to needing to come home.
You say his name was Christopher Golomby,
Mm-hmm.
and in that soldier's way, just as Adam had loved Doster,
Mm-hmm.
meaning Adam Schumann had
Yes.
loved Doster who was killed, he had loved Golomby too.
Right.
To be a soldier in combat was to fall in love constantly, and then Doster was dead and Golomby was saying what he said, and what did Adam do next? He fell apart alone and flew away alone and came home alone, and even with, and how do you pronounce his wife's name?
Saskia.
Saskia, and we have a picture that people can see, and Zoe and Jax, who were her children.
Children, right.
He has felt alone at times ever since.
Yes.
And before you answer that, tell us about his wife.
So that's Saskia Schumann, Adam's wife, who, as Adam was walking to the helicopter that day to come home, he stopped and he called Saskia and said he was on his way. And at one point in the conversation, Saskia said, I'm a little afraid of what you might do to me. And Adam assured her he wouldn't do anything, and he hung up. He said, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what I'm going to do. You know, that was just one more mystery. Saskia, like any military wife, I think, at the end of a deployment, well, actually, this wasn't the end. He was coming home ill. But she had her own set of expectations. He was going to come home. He would feel safe. They would heal together. Everything would be as it was. And that's how it started out for her. But over time, as the centerpiece of this family became this psychological wound, Saskia, a very strong person, she went from pure compassion to irritation to anger to fury that they couldn't get better. So this is one example of a family trying to heal.
Where do they live now?
Well, since the end of the book, and so much of the book takes place in Kansas, they've moved to North Dakota. The marriage didn't survive. At the end of the book, it's a rather, I think, a lovely kind of hopeful moment as Adam experiences his second homecoming from war, this time coming home from a treatment program. And, life went on, and they realized there was just too much poison to raise children the way they wanted to raise them. So they're separate. They're divorced, but they live near each other.
Would you tell us the moment when she thought he was going to commit suicide?
There were several, and you asked earlier, was I present for everything? And I was not present for this scene. And how could I really be present? I had been in Kansas, and I came back to Washington to do some reporting here, and I started getting some texts from Saskia saying, well, it's really hitting the fan now. And what had happened is, I mean, in this after-war, things escalate so quickly. Just a moment that seems so loving can just turn and flip and be so out of control. And this was one of those days, and it ended with Adam packing to leave, and Saskia going through his things and seeing a hidden handgun and saying, what's the deal? And he said, I just want to take this to sell it. I'm going to need some money, because they're, on top of all the other pressures, they had no money. And she just held the gun, and he went in a room and came out with a shotgun and really tried to jam it at her so she would, and get her goat so much that she would pull the trigger and kill him. And as I describe in the book, and this is based on what Saskia told me after, she wanted to. She wanted this over. She wanted to not only pull the trigger once, she wanted to pull the trigger twice. Just that's what it had come to. Instead, she steps out on the porch. She screams something like, just be a man. And she goes on the porch and comes back in a few minutes later, and he's nowhere in sight. And she searches all through the house. Finally goes downstairs into the basement at this horrible, the worst room in the house, this furnace room where Adam sometimes would do some work. And there he was sitting with a shotgun against his chin. And it went on for a while until she finally got him to put the gun away. But, and one more day in their lives, right? I know I'm supposed to be a reporter and completely distanced from this, but I know these people. I care about them. I feel, if you don't mind the expression, I feel privileged having written about them, and I'm so glad, obviously, that he's still alive.
There are a lot of stories about Adam and Saskia as you go through the book. Now, were you present for a lot of that? Were you in the car with them when they went places?
Yeah. That's just one scene where I wasn't there. I had to do some back reporting, but everything else I was present for.
And they let you write down anything, or did you record it, or did you write it down?
Well, I always like to remind people what the relationship is here. Yes, I want to see everything. I want to hear everything. I want to be present. But it's for a book, and I'm not their private confessor. And so, there's always a notebook or a digital recording or some visual representation of what the relationship is. But the credibility, Brian, came from the first book. They had read it. They knew what I did. I knew these folks. And so when I said I wanted to do this, I was yards ahead. It wasn't an act of introducing myself. The credibility was established because of the first book. And they, they want people to know what's going on.
I ask you that, maybe you don't know, but ask you this just to see the relevance of a book like this. Your first book,
yeah.
Do you know how many copies it sold?
I think maybe 150. It did pretty well. It's still selling. It's not been retired. It's an active book. And
was that what you expected?
I expected the book to absolutely disappear. I expected it to sell 5 copies, and those would be my 5 copies, right? These are not the most popular wars. But there was something about this first book. It did find its place. It did resonate, and it was a word of mouth thing, and it kept spreading, and it still sells quite well.
As you know, Eric Shinseki was the head of the Army. Now he's the head of the Veterans Administration.
Right.
Here's a speech he's given about some of the things you talk about. Get your reaction to it.
Okay.
Of the more than 30,000 suicides in this country each year, fully 20% of them are acts by veterans. That means, on average, 18 veterans commit suicide each day. 5 of those veterans are under our care at VA. So losing 5 veterans who are in treatment every month, and then not having a shot at the other 13 who for some reason haven't come under our care, means that we have a lot of work to do.
What do you think? What kind of a grade would you give the Veterans Administration for dealing with suicide?
Well, I want to, you'll hate this answer. These are, I think some of the strength of these books is they are free of my opinion. And I don't want to mess that up now by giving a grade or an opinion. I can reflect the experiences of what I saw, and maybe that'll help people make their own decisions.
Let me ask it maybe a different way.
Okay.
How much have you sensed that the military and the Veterans Administration are worried about suicide? And because you do the General Corelli in here.
Yeah. So one of the people readers will spend time with in this new book is Pete Corelli, who a 4-star in the Army who helped run the Iraq War for a while, came home, was promoted to Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, and part of his brief included mental health wounds, and more specifically suicide is the number, and we know this, we've read this, the number of suicides in active military, Guard reserves has been steadily rising. Enough that the military is authentically concerned, not just box checking, authentically concerned, what's going on, what can we do about this? So Corelli had this idea of convening a monthly meeting.
And by the way, he used to be number 2 in the Army.
He was number 2, yeah, during this. And he came up with the idea for this monthly meeting, maybe 20 guys around a conference table, video link-ups to various posts around the world. And for 2 hours, they would sit there and go through suicide after suicide. Each suicide got like 5 minutes. What happened? What lessons have we learned? And if anybody knows Corelli, he's a smart guy, and he's passionate. He's almost obsessive. He was really going after this. And he would say, I want nothing less than to change the culture of the Army. And by that, not just reducing suicide, but making it more acceptable for people to say, you know, I've got a psychological wound, and get past the stigma of such a thing. Now, he didn't do this. No one, arguably, changes the culture of the Army, but he went at it hard for 3 years, and he didn't shy away from these meetings, and these were pretty brutal affairs.
General Shinseki said that they were dying at the rate of 18 a day, and you say the number, that was back in 2010, the number's gone up?
Yeah, one of the reporters I edited at the Washington Post looked at that number, and there were some other people. He didn't look at it. He didn't determine this. He found people within the VA system who were studying it hard, and so now the number works out to about 22 a day.
22 suicides a day from are these?
Yeah, but it's not just Iraq, Afghan. These are anybody who's served, who's in the VA system, and so of course you look at the numbers. A lot of these are Vietnam guys, and the hard part seems to be that yes, they've committed suicide, but they've had years, they've had decades of other life experiences since serving. So you can say yes, it was a suicide. Yes, it was a guy who served. But I don't think it's a clean line. There's no way to have a clean line to say it was directly related to a war experience.
You have, back to Mr. Shuman, you have him meeting with one of his so-called best friends, Stephen, in the middle of all this. And they had a lunch with the wives, and I just want to read, I'm sure you remember this, where they met again a few years later when Adam was home too, and both were trying to recover in the Fort Riley WTU. What's that?
Right, so that's the initials for a Warrior Transition Unit, also called a WTB, or Warrior Transition Battalion. As the psychological injuries, as the Army realized there's something going on here, they created these special units, special attention, to try, in theory, help a guy get back to his unit or make the transition into civilian life. That's the intent of these things.
So, you're right. They decided to introduce their wives to each other, and first at dinner, things were rolling along just fine, right up until Stephen pitched forward and began trembling. Saskia watched horrified.
Right.
Worse, Stephen's wife, Christina, who was in the middle of telling a story, kept on with it until she saw the look on Saskia's face. He'll get up, she said, with a calmness of someone who had seen this before. He's fine.
Right. Right, and he got up.
Were you there, by the way, for that one?
I was not there. That was another instance where this came out of a reported conversation with Saskia and then with the Morrows. And yeah, I mean, Stephen had a tough deployment as well, and he has some injuries to deal with. That's something that happened one day, and he got up and they continued. But you know, these are hard things.
But you go on to talk about what seemed to be an interesting twist in this: the money, the $11,000.
Yeah. Well,
did that? Tell that story.
Well, it's more of a way to get across how hurt and jilted I think Adam and Saskia were feeling by the whole shebang, the whole system. That they were really in the midst of everything. They were just scraping by, trying to find money. And Stephen called up one day and said for some reason they had just found a bunch of money in their checking account that came from the government. I think it was, what, $10,000, $11,000?
$11,000, yeah.
And it's just one more thing that made Adam and Saskia just feel lousy about what their life had come to. And so if you read in the book this little section where they seem to be angry at the good luck their friends had gotten, it was really just a way of saying how hurt they were becoming by nothing working out for them. And of course, like any of us, they wanted things to work out.
How did they make friends under these circumstances? And at the time you wrote they were living near Fort Riley?
Right. So there's a line in the book, something like, if the truth of war turns out to be you're finally in it for the guy next to you, the truth of the after war is that you're pretty much on your own. And Adam came back, and even though he had this family, he was more and more isolated in this kind of shameful conversation he's been having with himself. There's a thing I describe in the book, There's another guy named Michael Emery.
I was going to get to that.
Oh,
it's
well,
right in that same chapter. But go ahead.
So Emery was a guy who early in the deployment was shot in his head. He was on a rooftop, and a sniper got a clean shot into his head. And
in Iraq.
In Iraq, and he went down on this rooftop. They needed to get him down 3 flights of stairs, and so Adam Schumann put Emery on his back and huffed and puffed his way down the stairway. And I don't want to get too graphic here, but what happened is much of the blood coming out of Emery's head wound kind of drained into Adam's mouth. And on the day I met him 6 months later, when he was leaving, the taste of this blood was still something that was quite fresh.
Well, let me read what you wrote.
Okay.
Just quickly. He remembered the taste of blood, the smell of blood, the heat of the blood, and the wet of the blood as it spilled down his chin and onto his uniform and through his uniform and onto his skin.
Yeah, so that's what he remembered. And so what happened is Emery was medevaced out and should be dead, but somehow is alive.
How old was he?
He was a little older. I'm trying to remember, Brian. I think young 30s at that point.
Where was this in Sergeant Schumann's tour over there in Iraq?
Well, again, this was Schumann's 3rd tour, okay? But it was the beginning of the 3rd tour. They were out on a mission. This was April 2007. I wasn't on that rooftop. I was probably a block away when this happened.
Did you talk to him right after it happened?
Schumann, no, because I didn't meet Schumann until he was leaving 6 months later. I was walking around, going around with commanders, and they were getting the radio reports of all the shootings and all the injuries taking place on that particular mission. Emery is, I guess, a version of what the Army keeps talking about as resilience. He's alive, he walks, he talks, but he's missing a good chunk of his brain, and especially the part that regulates emotions, and he's had a tough go of it, and he lives in Georgia now. He's a great guy. He's pretty much on his own. And
entirely? Was he married?
Well, yeah, but he was taken care of by a woman at Bethesda, and I remember going to visit him while she was there, and she kept saying, "I love you, I love you, I love you," and he was barely walking or talking. She stuck with him. But then as he recuperated and he couldn't control his anger, it reached the point where he had his wife and their baby moved to a different state because he had gone a little berserk one day and destroyed a tree. He couldn't help himself.
Lives in a double-wide trailer.
And so they went away to another state, and so his kid wouldn't, as I describe in the book, wouldn't have to grow up around a man such as himself. And that's the generous thing he could do. So he's kind of living on his own. And one day, he got in touch with Schumann by Facebook. They found each other, and he said, "I want to come visit." Schumann hadn't seen him since the day he was on his back. And so Adam's going through what he's going through here in Kansas. Emery's over here in Georgia, and they get together for a weekend, and honest to God, it was this tenderness I described between soldiers. Here it is. Here it is.
Did you
right
see
in
it?
front. Yeah.
You there?
Yes. And it was the most heartbreaking, gorgeous weekend imaginable.
Well, explain that. Michael Emery stayed in a hotel or a motel.
Yeah. And Schumann, who sometimes was incapable of just saying a word to his family in any kind of tender way, would go over, knock on the door. He realized that Emery needed help getting a brace on, getting dressed. Just the way they behaved toward each other. It was quite something to see.
But Sergeant Schumann's wife watched this, and what was her reaction?
Well, she's thinking, he's capable of this. Why isn't he capable of this with me? It's like three-dimensional chess. There's so many moves and sub-moves going on in any interaction. You know what it was like in a way? There was a point reporting the first book where you realize all the levels of mistrust and interpretation going on. For instance, here goes this convoy of soldiers out into a neighborhood, and they see a kid waving. And this is what you're supposed to do, make friends with the populace. So what is the kid seeing? This waving kid is seeing, here come the Americans, but the Americans are in this armored, up-armor Humvee, behind thick window, almost no skin showing because they're so protected from bomb blasts, and the waving hand is not even a hand, it's a glove. So that's what the kid sees. And what the soldiers are seeing is this waving kid, but maybe he's waving or maybe he's signaling to somebody, hit the trigger now. And, that was the war, trying to figure out what's really going on, what's the motivation for any action. And so it is in the after-war, when Saskia, so eager to have her family healed, and very moved by what's going on between her husband and this other soldier, is also feeling a little hurt and jealous by what's going on between her husband and this soldier.
This is not, as you know, it's not a long book. It's 256 pages.
Right.
Your first one was how long?
A little longer, maybe 280 pages.
And who decided that you were going to keep it short? Relatively short.
Well, I guess I did. I wrote everything I had to say and then thought, I'm done.
So how did you go about the writing of this? When did you write this new book?
I reported this new book off and on for a couple of years, and then, was it last year, I guess, I just kind of sat down, and I had this pile of notes, and you know, it's a good thing to do, to take a pile of chronology and then engage with it and then shape it into, because this is storytelling. It's not just documentation. I'm telling a story about these people. And to engage with the material every day and shape it into a narrative with figure out the beginning, figure out the end, outline all the things that happen in the middle. It took about a year, and that was a pretty good thing to do.
What's your technique of writing? Where do you write?
At the beginning, first sentence, and then when I'm satisfied with it, I'll write the next one. So it's slow. I don't know another way to do it. I just write and rewrite my way to the end, and when I write the last sentence, I'm pretty much done.
Your first sentence is in the prologue. You could see it in his nervous eyes. How long does it take you to decide to write that sentence?
You know, that's a lift from the first book. The prologue comes from the first book, The Good Soldiers, just to establish the character of Adam on the day he left the war and saw that the helicopter he was leaving on was a Red Cross helicopter, and how defeating that was to him. So it's just a very short prologue that introduces, this is an after-war book. Here's a guy who left with some sense of shame. You turn the page, and then the new book is underway. And the first line of the new book is, 2 years later, Adam drops the baby, and we go forward from there.
Well, let's go to the end then.
Well, don't give away the end. I want some people to buy this book.
I won't then. That's a fair trade.
Go back. You give them the beginning and the end. And,
well,
thanks for coming by.
There's a lot of copy in there. Let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Let's go back to the dedication page.
Okay.
For Phyllis Beekman, who taught me about damage and recovery.
Okay. Yes.
Who is she?
My mom, and you know, the first book was a tough book to report because it was physically scary. This second book was tough in some ways because it got into some pretty intimate, painful psychological territory. And while I wasn't really prepared in some ways to know what war was like in the first book, I did know what mental damage is from growing up in a family where my mom battled this for a while, and there was some suicide attempts. So I went into this book with some understanding of what these families might be going through when suicide became an everyday presence.
Is Mom still alive?
She's not. No. But she was alive for the first book, and
what was her reaction?
You know, she was glad I was safe. And she was glad that my journalism had allowed me to finally write something that, instead of dismissing, I was proud of.
How close, when you were during the time you were over there, the 8 months you were in country, did you come close to getting fired on, or did get fired on, or?
Yeah, well, everybody was there. Everybody got fired on, right? So it happened, and I want to be careful because if there's a soldier watching, I don't want any to think that I'm aligning myself at all with what soldiers have gone through, and they had to carry weapons. They didn't get to leave whenever they wanted to take breaks, things like that. Nonetheless, they were on the ground for actually about 14 months, and I was with them for a little more than 8 months. And yeah, things happened, and I was there, and things happened that I was in the midst of as well. But the good thing about that was when I showed up, of course soldiers didn't want a reporter in their midst, and they didn't know what a reporter was. They thought I had an agenda. Liberal press, every reporter thinks a soldier is a war criminal. Every reporter thinks a soldier is a baby killer, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not like I call them together and tell them otherwise, but by staying, by not visiting this thing, but staying, and then by staying and being in the midst of some bad things, and the smoke clearing, and the soldiers see me at the edge taking notes and not becoming a problem for them, then that's where the credibility came from for this book and for the new book.
You also dedicate this to Elizabeth Helen Hill for saying okay.
Yeah. My wife, and when I asked her to marry me, she said, okay.
Did she know what she was going to get?
Does anyone?
Well, what I mean, you know what I mean. Did she know that, and what did she think of you going into harm's way? Yeah,
she was okay with it because, I make a lame joke. I'll now make this lame joke that after 33 years of marriage, one day she said, don't you have a war to go to, or something like that. Of course she was worried, but we have a marriage where we allow each other the things we want to do, and she knew I wanted to do this, and so I did.
Let's go back to the writing part of this.
Okay.
Where do you write a book like this?
Back room of my house. Good view of my back lawn, nice colors, good windows, and that's where I spent my time. It was pretty fun. You know, first of all, it was helpful to engage with this stuff, but it was also, I wasn't in the office. I would wake up, go downstairs, write a sentence. If I liked the sentence, I'd walk into the kitchen, I'd grab a cookie, come back, write a sentence, grab a cookie. This is not the worst year of my life.
And do you write it quickly?
No.
I mean, do you ever get into where you just, things are coming at you, or do you really eat a cookie between every sentence?
Well, I eat a lot of cookies. This is pretty a systematic thing. I kind of have been taught by people who do this. I look up to them. I think they're better at this than me, and when they've described what they do, most of them seem to have an end point in mind and work backwards and make calculations. So I knew if the book was due in so many months, I had a very good outline. I knew what my chapters were going to be and the points I wanted to hit in the chapter. And you just do the math. I've got 3 weeks per chapter, so get busy. And I think having deadlines allows me to live with some sentences that otherwise I'd be finessing for the rest of my life. I can pick up the first book and just randomly open to any page and point to a sentence, and I'll do this sometimes, and look at the sentence and think, what was I thinking on that one? But nonetheless, the cumulative effect is I got this story right, and one of the reasons I know that is because of the reactions of soldiers since that book has come out. Writing emails, and hundreds of them by now, saying a version of, so I was in war, came home, everyone wants to know what it's like, don't want to talk about it, can't talk about it. I read your book, now I give people the book and say, read this thing and you'll know what it was like and why I can't talk about it. That's a pretty good endorsement that the story I told was not some naive journalist story, but by staying and paying attention and listening and gaining credibility and getting their trust, I wrote a book that pretty much mirrors their experience. And that was the intent, to describe, these are significant wars. And there had been policy books, there were memoirs, but there had not been this journalistic account of the ground level far end of policy, if that makes sense. And that's what the first book was, and now you can add to the archive, this is what's going on currently with people, some of the people who have been in those wars.
I'm going to assume something by asking this question. When were you the most frustrated with some aspect of the military or the U.S. government getting in your way, not being helpful?
No, I got pretty lucky because the forward operating base where these guys were was such a lousy place that there were no public affairs officers. So I was pretty much on my own.
Well, explain the difference between having a public affairs officer there and not.
Well, I think over time, and I should be careful because actually the PAO for these guys, he was a great guy, but he was also on another place. So he wasn't present. He wasn't, how's it going, David? What are you up to? How can I help? I was pretty much on my own. The battalion commander had said, come on over, I'll give you a full run, and he was good to his word. So that's a huge break. I really, I got to decide every day what I wanted to do, what I wanted to see. The only barriers to reporting were barriers I would put up myself, and I didn't put up barriers. It was full guns ahead.
What's the, and you do this in the book, but what's the women, the wife, the girlfriend side of this story that people miss?
So in the second book, there aren't many women in the first book because it's an infantry battalion, and infantry, at least for now, is an all-male enterprise. And when I made the decision to follow some of these same people in the new book, I'm not describing the experiences of women who have served and are dealing with things. That's not this book. That's going to be another book for another person. The women in this book were their widows, their wives, their girlfriends. They're the people who were back here. And now the war has shifted. You can just forgive the corniness, but it's like the front lines have become their houses for this after-war part. And they're what you'd expect. They want things to be better, but they're not victims by any sense, even though in some ways they have been victimized by the war experience. But they're strong, interesting people, all dealing with their own set of problems as they realize this thing wasn't just over there, now it's back here. Now we got to deal with this.
What other spouse in your book did you find to have the most interesting story?
Oh, they all did. I'm
well, don't
sorry.
call it the most interesting. Just pick one of them.
Well, so Saskia Schumann is an amazing person. Amanda Doster, whose husband died. And
Jim Doster.
James Doster. And we talked about him earlier. He was the one who died on the day that Adam didn't go out on the mission. And his wife, his widow, 3 years later, is still missing him so thoroughly that on a given day she might be driving in small town Kansas and be stopped at a light and look at the pest control truck next to her. This happened to her. And there was her husband driving the truck. And it all made such sense to her in that moment. He left the war. He didn't want to be there. He came home. He got a job driving a pest control truck. He's saving money. He's laying low. And sometime soon he's going to come home and ring the bell and say, I'm home. And after years of this and an inability to move on and friends losing patience with her, then we get to see Amanda Doster on the day as an attempt at closing a previous chapter out. She decides to take some of her benefit money for his dying and move out of the house where she promised he would be when he came home, the last place she saw him, the place they rang the doorbell to say that he was dead. And this act of moving 2 miles down the street to a new house was supposed to be an attempt at healing for her. That's really interesting to me.
There's a lot of scenes that you tell us about where walls are, fists go into walls and a lot of damage done. Were you there when that ever happened?
Yeah.
Where?
Yeah.
Which one?
Well, let me tell you one I wasn't there for, if I can. If I can switch a little bit, because I want to talk about this one soldier to help get across the idea of what these folks are dealing with. And if I can do it quickly, there's a guy named Tesolo Ayeti, and he was blown up in a Humvee one day, and I was there that day. I was not in the convoy. I was down at the aid station when they brought Ayeti in. And yeah, so there he is, like right after the explosion. And 5 guys in a Humvee. Yeah, that look on his face. 5 guys in a Humvee. The thing is blown up into the air, comes down hard. Ayeti has a broken leg, gets out of the Humvee. I mean, this thing has just been blown up, okay? Broken leg, realizes there's still guys inside, so makes his way back to the Humvee and helps pull out a couple of other wounded guys. No one, not Ayeti, not anyone, gets to the driver, a 19-year-old who burns to death in his seat as the thing catches fire and rounds go off. So, you know, I remember meeting Ayeti at the aid station and being with him when he found out that the other guy had died. What happened after that? And so this is a guy who, Brian, I think if you were in that war on that day, you would like to behave as he behaved.
He's a Samoan.
American Samoan, and that's what he did. Then he begins having this dream. And the dream is of the guy who died, not the guys he helped save. The guy who died, and in the dream the guy is on fire saying, "Why didn't you save me?" So after, you know, maybe a year, couple of years of this dream, Ayeti falls apart, destroys his apartment, has to be hospitalized for a little bit, then is put in a PTSD program run by the VA, and what happens to him in that program and what happens to others who try to get in that program that I describe in the book, it gets at one of the results of these wars is we now have a system in place to at least try to help psychologically wounded folks, but their experiences show what an overwhelmed and in many ways flawed system these guys get to heal in.
Is there another book in this?
Well, what do you think? I don't know. Guys go to war, guys come home.
I mean, what's your sense when you finish this? Did you say there's going to be a third book that follows up 5 years from now?
I wanted there to be. I don't want to give up this story. But no, I'm not seeing it. I'm not seeing what the third book is. My interest will be there, but I don't know how. I mean, this is a business, right? And I may want to tell a story, but it doesn't mean a publisher will want to publish it.
We only have a couple seconds left. Why have you done a very strenuous book tour?
A book tour? Because I'm trying as hard as I can to get people interested in this story. Yeah, of course I want to sell books, but there's something underneath it. Now I know, now I understand what these folks have been through. And I got to see it, and I got to tell it, so I want to go around and do what I can to get people to have an accurate sense of what's going on. Not over there anymore, it's here. But it's happening coast to coast, and it's not the worst thing to pay attention to it.
I don't have any more time left, but I noticed that you are a senior writer in residence at the Center for New American Security?
I was, yes.
No
yes.
more?
No, I was a writer in residence, and they helped support the book by paying for a lot of my travel.
David Finkel, we've got to go back to that cover shot that you have from the New York Times photographer.
Right.
What kind of a plane are they in?
What kind?
Is that a C-5 or a C-17?
God, here goes my head. C-17. Yeah, the big one with the jets, not the props. Yes.
Name of this book by David Finkel is Thank You for Your Service, a follow-up to his first book called The Good Soldiers. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Brian.
Free transcripts, or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at Q&A.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.
Next, British